and we're going to be talking about this concept of cycle syncing and diving into some of the evidence and then what that means in practice for both athletes as well as coaches and people giving advice. Before we get to this, it should probably be useful to explain some background concepts and terminology. So Professor Elliott-Sale, if you'll help me out here, can you maybe talk about some of the typical hormonal changes that occur across the menstrual cycle and some of the useful terminology that people might be aware of?
So what you're looking at here in this graphic are two hormones, estrogen, which is in purple, and progesterone, which is in that sort of grey colour. And these two hormones fluctuate across the menstrual cycle. Estrogen almost on a daily basis, and progesterone more so on a weekly basis. Now, you might have heard that every menstrual cycle is 28 days long, or once a month, it lasts a month. But actually, we know that some menstrual cycles are as short as 21 days and they can still be healthy, or they can be as long as 35 days and still be healthy. Now, the other thing to note about the menstrual cycle is we love to divide it into specific phases, and we do so by, the phases are based on different concentrations of these hormones. So, for example, in phase 1, estrogen and progesterone are low. In phase 2, estrogen is very high, progesterone is low. And then in phase 4, I can count, I know I've skipped 3, but in phase 4, progesterone is high and there's a secondary peak in estrogen. The reason why I didn't mention phase 3 is it's a bit of a transition phase, and actually we're mostly interested in the big or the significant changes. So hopefully you'll have seen from this particular figure that the menstrual cycle is not static, so it is a very dynamic process. It is not 28 days. It can be for some women some of the time, but not all women all of the time. So what I really want you to take away is it's highly variable, the cycle length is variable, and the phases are not at a fixed point. So lots of variability to consider.
Fantastic. And so, Professor Halson, when it comes to recovery, one of the things that sometimes gets mentioned is the potential role of some of these hormones and the changes within them, or even claims around, is there differences between sexes based on some of these hormones in terms of people's recovery? Do we have evidence around this, and what is the current state of the evidence?
Yes, I'm going to sound like I'm just repeating myself, but no, there's no evidence to suggest that recovery is different across different phases of the cycle, nor that women or men require different recovery strategies to optimise their performance. So there's a little bit of evidence, like we know that in the luteal phase there might be a decrease in heart rate variability and increase in heart rate. But for us, that's just the way I interpret that, is that it doesn't mean we need different recovery strategies. It just means that if you're monitoring these things as part of your training program, that you might need to take that into consideration. But no, there's no really good, solid evidence. I admit there hasn't been many studies, but there's also no good evidence to suggest that you will recover differently at different phases of the cycle.
As the name of our topic suggests, one of the things we wanted to get to is this concept of cycle syncing, which is incredibly popular, and people have seen a variety of different claims about this. Professor Phillips, first, could you maybe define for us what this is, what people are typically referring to when this term cycle syncing is used?
Yeah, cycle syncing refers to changing your training according to the phase of your menstrual cycle. I think that there's various sort of definitions that are out there, lots of different opinions on this. I think one thing that we can't discount is that women definitely experience different symptoms throughout their cycles, and one woman is not like the next woman with respect to how you might feel about training, your motivation, how training might make you feel. But there's certainly no one way to do it. And I think that's what sort of cycle syncing has branded itself as, is that you are more anabolic and so predisposed to gaining muscle, and you're stronger during your follicular phase, and then you are catabolic and weaker during your luteal phase. Now, some women may feel that way, and I won't discount that, but from a physiological standpoint, there's actually no evidence to suggest that there's much difference. In fact, some women find it exactly the reverse. So I think that the notion of trying to sync cycles and affect your training that way is going to be tough to get a physiological basis for. But feeling-wise, there's some evidence behind it for sure.
And we'll certainly spend some time talking about some of those symptoms as well as training itself. But if we turn to nutrition just briefly before we move on, some other claims people may hear, Professor Phillips, relate to differences in what nutrients may be needed or best handled at different times, and you need to radically change dietary strategies for athletes at different times. Could you maybe speak to some of that and what evidence we have?
Yeah, I think it's sounding like a bit of a broken record, but I mean, the changes in hormones, even though they are obviously quite distinct and result in very different physiological states, from a nutritional perspective, again, there's probably even less evidence to suggest that nutrition should change from one phase of the cycle to another. So there was a group that attempted to look at all of the literature in this area and synthesize it, and really came away with, what we don't have a consensus. There's nothing that appears to be, a trend that's coming out. So I don't think that there's any evidence to say, you should do this in this phase and this in this phase. And that's the same for all women. So I think Dr. Elliott-Sale put it really, really well, is no one woman has the same cycle as the next woman. And even a woman from cycle to cycle can be different as well. So with all of those things considered, I think it would be hard to put hard and fast recommendations nutrition-wise for sure.
And so, Professor Elliott-Sale, can you maybe talk about where some of these things come from? In that, does the role of these different hormones have an effect on, say, training? Where did we first start to suggest that there could be an impact, that they're playing a role on either recovery or performance? Where does that sort of come from?
Ooh, good question. I think for such a long time, we never spoke about some of these female-specific considerations. So, you often hear people say the menstrual cycle was a taboo topic in sport. But I think we've maybe that pendulum swing effect. And now where it's come out of, hiding, and we didn't talk about it, it's sort of become the everything. And so I think we need to sort of course, correct. And so you were asking me, what do these hormones do? What's the rationale that sits behind possible changes in performance? So first and foremost, I always need to remind athletes, practitioners, everybody, that these two hormones are reproductive hormones. So their primary function is to prepare the body for pregnancy. So that's their primary function. That's what they're there to do. Now they have a whole host of secondary functions related to health. So again, these hormones, have roles in cardiovascular health, bone health. So we talk a lot about estrogen and bone health. Cognition. So they're traveling to lots of other places in the body for these secondary health roles. And then we have to think about what's left over or what's available for these other sort of performance effects that we're now starting to think about. And, theoretically, we have estrogen and progesterone receptors pretty much all over the body. So theoretically, there is a biologically plausible pathway, but we don't have research data that says actually it goes to the muscle and it causes you to be weaker or stronger. So the research evidence for the direct physiological effect is lacking. There's, not a lot of evidence, and the evidence that we have is a real mixed bag in terms of quality. Just like Professor Phillips said, I'd like to just highlight there are indirect possible effects, I think, on performance. Two of the main ones, or maybe we'll go for three if that's okay. So one is around the physical act of bleeding. So as female athletes menstruate as part of the menstrual cycle, again caused by the changes in the hormones, some female athletes are distracted by that bleeding, or they're anxious about it. So whether they're anticipating it might come in the middle of an event, or they're already, menstruating and they're worried about potentially leaking into their uniform, and obviously, that could be possibly embarrassing for them. So if you're anxious, if you're distracted, that could impact upon your performance. So that could be an indirect way. The second way is very much around the symptoms, like Professor Phillips said. And I really need to make the point that it's not all women who have menstrual cycle symptoms. It is some, but not all. So again, I think we just need to be careful that we don't imply that every female athlete's going to be impacted. I know many who are not. And if you have menstrual cycle symptoms, there's a clue here. It's called the menstrual cycle. So the symptoms would be cyclical, and if they're cyclical, then you can anticipate when they're coming, okay? And if you can anticipate when they're coming, you could adapt your training based on that, okay? So autoregulation, right, Professor Phillips? Been around since the 1940s, not a new concept. Men do it, women can do it, okay, that's fine. But if you know they're coming, and if they have a negative impact on your performance, why don't you get ahead of that and mitigate against those negative symptoms? So I think, that's another indirect way. And then the last one is around perception. You know, there's a lot of noise on social media telling female athletes they'll win in this phase, they'll lose in that phase, they'll get injured in another phase. And actually, we know the perception sometimes shapes reality. So again, we just need to be really careful about the narrative that we're putting out to female athletes. So a little bit of nuance there, but from a physiological point of view, no direct link that we've seen yet, but maybe some indirect ones that need some consideration.
Yeah, and to build on some of those indirect impacts, and as you know, on an individual level, some of these things will be playing a role. Emily, earlier, we had mentioned that you do some things to note and adapt your training based on your individual responses that you've noted, and you also don't have the luxury of picking when an event is going to take place. No. Can you maybe speak to your experiences in doing that, of taking your own individual responses to things and adapting that to your training, making it work around it, but also not letting that perception of, oh, I'm not going to be able to do this, creep in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously these guys have, you know, absolutely smashed it. You know, it's individual, and I feel different from one cycle to the other. My training is different sometimes. There's the key things that we found that kind of affects me a little bit. I get this newfound mobility that is lovely, and I would love to stay, but I can't really control it at the top weights. So sometimes I have to, you know, think smartly if we're going to go that heavy that day, because I might not have the same control. So it's more about like injury prevention more than anything like affecting performance. And my proprioception sometimes is a little bit off. So sometimes we hone into the things like the squats and the deadlifts that are more the single movements than more the compound movements, just for me to be able to build there. And it's just generally as well like the indirect factors. So the fact I get very painful periods. So sometimes you come into training, you just feel awful. And it's not the fact that it's anything to do with it's just to do with the way that you feel that day, and how can you make yourself feel better. Be a little bit more hydrated, a little bit more carbs to give yourself a little bit more energy while you're in that session, because you feel like that you might not have slept. So it's more the things that happen to you that affect everything around you than the actual like cycle. But then I can come in on, you know, I've clean and jerked a PB on my cycle, on the first day of my cycle. So, you know, the cycle before I'd have been no good for it whatsoever, and then the cycle next month was moving great. And I think it's just about having that open communication, and it's something that's really good within our sport actually. Like, we have all male coaches, but actually they're really clued in. They're really clued in about what's going on. We talk very often, we speak openly about it, we tell them how we feel, and then we just base training off how we feel on a day-to-day basis when we're on our cycle. And I think it took them a while to adapt to that also, because they just thought, oh, we're on a period, we're gonna wrap them in cotton wool because they can't do anything. And they used to be like, hold on a minute, like, I haven't warmed up yet, like, let me warm up first, you know. So there used to be a lot of times where we go back and forth, and then they start to realize now that they just have to treat it on a cycle by cycle basis. There's obviously bits and bobs that we've used. I'm in a category where I'm the 1%, right? I'm trying to be the best that I can be. I'm trying to push my body to whole new limits. So there's some things that we do try that may not have all the research to support it, but there might be that little bit, and if it's gonna help me, we're gonna give it a crack to see if it helps. So we tried like carb rinsing while I was warming up. So through my warm-up sets on snatch, I would carb rinse up to about 90%, and then after that we just crack on and finish the drink. And that was something we felt helped and gave me that. But also a lot of this stuff is just psychological. And I feel a lot of the time for athletes with a lot of things, sometimes if it makes you feel better in your head, that's going to give you a better performance. So sometimes these little faffy things, actually give them a try, because then, you know, if you wake up in a better mood that day and you have a better training session, then it's all right, innit? Yeah,
that's fantastic, yeah. And I think that speaks to a lot of the things that are really important that Dr. Elliott-Sale mentioned around the perception of if you have the perception you are going to train worse, then that's probably going to have some sort of impact. But also noting those individual differences and being able to apply them and modify your training is not the same as saying everyone else needs to follow this particular structure, or at this point you are going to experience it this way. So I think that really gives people a lot to work with. One of the things, Professor Halson, that comes up is, while sometimes there might not be some direct effects, do we see differences in things like impacts on sleep across a menstrual cycle with changes in hormones that could then have knock-on effects on things like recovery?
Yeah, so there's been a little bit of research in non-athletes, and we sort of decided a few years ago to try and answer this question in in athletes, and we've done probably 3 projects now looking at sleep across the menstrual cycle. We used the queen of female physiology's gold standard measurements for the menstrual cycle, which is Professor Kirsty Elliott-Sale. We used gold standard measurements of sleep, looking at lots of different devices, and we really didn't see anything. Sleep didn't change across the menstrual cycle. We measured the hormone concentrations. The hormone concentrations weren't related to sleep. But like everyone else on the panel has said, the one thing that was related to slightly disturbed sleep in some participants was when they had higher symptoms, and that's essentially all we saw. Moving forward in this space, so obviously we can't forget that as women age, perimenopause and menopause, we know there are people find that their sleep is really disturbed, and of course in pregnancy. From that regard, I expect to see issues with sleep, but across a normal menstrual cycle, very, very few issues.
Professor Phillips, one of the things that creeps into these conversations when different hormones are mentioned or related differences between men and women in response to training or nutrition, for example, is that there are distinct differences in how they should train and how they will adapt, and that being the main difference as opposed to all the other factors that could be playing a role that are probably more important variables to look at on an individual athlete basis. Could you maybe speak a bit to this and explain some of the things that maybe is misplaced and where people are putting more of their focus?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think for a long time, the focus in what was it that drove, you know, muscle gain and strength gain and weightlifting and resistance training in particular was around testosterone. And, you know, just the casual observation, men are bigger, broader, they have more muscle, and wow, that's, of course, that's testosterone. That's true when boys and girls go through puberty. Boys get a pubertal surge in testosterone, they gain muscle, they get bigger, and that's an advantage that they probably retain for their entire life. But we now have a number of studies in men and women training beside each other in parallel, comparisons between studies that show that actually women gain, relatively speaking, they start with generally lower muscle, the same amount of muscle as men. And in fact, in some studies, it may even favor women in terms of the amount of strength that they gain. So I think that puts a pretty big nail in the coffin that it's all driven by testosterone, because of course women have tenfold less testosterone than men. And at the same time shows you that the physiological response is dictated as much probably by the amount of effort that's put into the training as by the hormonal environment. So, and I do think, you know, looking at the Olympics, we've got gender parity now, and looking at the way, we have a great example right here of how women perform. I've seen some of what this young lady can do, and it's impressive. It would break me in half. So, yeah, I don't think it's a hormonal-driven phenomenon at all. Yeah.
Professor Elliott-Sale, of course, you've done a huge amount of research in this area, but you've also been involved on the practical application side with elite level sport across some of the most well-known athletes and teams in this country and beyond. Can you maybe talk to your experiences with some of those conversations you would have had with those athletes to try and get past maybe misconceptions or concerns they had related to these type of issues?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of different examples I could give you. So first is around what they're seeing on social media. And so I do spend a lot of time debunking, demystifying some of those things. And, you know, social media is great. And I think I heard Professor Phillips say that. But, you know, the content can be engaging, it can be capturing and actually quite compelling. So it's easy to buy into that, and then I turn up little old me, and I don't really speak like an influencer. I speak like a scientist, and I'm trying to convince them that the opposite is true. So, you know, that's often where the conversation starts, trying to walk back some of that stuff that they've seen that isn't, you know, evidence-based. Then there's some interesting conversations around menstrual cycle symptoms. Now, I know we've spoken about this a couple of times, but one thing that I think maybe is spoken about less is the big shopping list of menstrual cycle symptoms. So what I mean by that is I'll often go and work with a new athlete and I'll say, you know, tell me about your menstrual cycle symptoms. And for those who have them, out comes the list. And I look at that and I go, okay, so how do you know that these are related to your menstrual cycle? And they're like, well, I'm a girl and I have a menstrual cycle and these things are bad, they suck. So they're menstrual cycle symptoms, right? So what we do is we ask them to make a note, a diary of their symptoms across 3 consecutive cycles. it's really simple science, it's not even science. We overlay all the symptoms. Do they occur at the same time? Are they cyclical? So I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. And often a lot of those menstrual cycle symptoms that were being attributed to the menstrual cycle, are not cyclical. And so therefore we start to look, if it's scattergun, we think, okay, what else could it be? And we've had some other examples. We saw one athlete whose headaches were linked to dehydration, bad hydration strategy. And so actually by doing this simple exercise, we can get rid of often a lot of symptoms that were perceived to be the menstrual cycle ones. The multidisciplinary team, quite often the nutritionist has got great fixes for lots of these things. And then when we get down to those, maybe one or two that are cyclical, then again, it's about being proactive. Do you need to change something to your diet or to your training program? So that's probably where I spend a lot of my time, that's sort of the conversations. And then I guess lastly, we talk about performance and their own performance, and we're always keen to hear their experiences. So, lived experiences are super important. But again, sometimes they need help navigating that. So, you could say, I won in this phase, so this is my winning phase. But you might also have had great sleep. You'd just come back from a break, all these things. You'd optimized your nutrition. So, that cause and effect, it's going to be rare. It's just one thing. Yep. So, we talk about and we navigate their lived experiences. And, I remind them that actually, whilst we may not have a lot of research evidence, it's almost a good thing. They have the freedom. Medals have been won and lost on every day of the menstrual cycle. PBs have been set. So I think giving them that freedom to think about, what are their lived experiences? How do we position that amongst everything else? But knowing that actually, whilst we're waiting for this great evidence to come through, that they don't have to be too limited and constrained in their practice. They can go out and win on any day.
Yeah. And so speaking of those conversations, Emily, maybe from the athlete side, you already mentioned how important it is to have the support of your coaches and the job they do. Can you maybe talk about just how important that's been, that you can not only discuss these things and work out things for your training with them, but to feel comfortable and be able to go through those types of conversations to help you adapt that training?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, you always want to feel that you can go into a space that you spend obviously a lot of time in, and just to be able to say how you feel, menstrual cycle or not, and then obviously to be able to do that one, your menstrual cycle. And, I'm from a sport where, like I said, we're very open with it, we discuss it. And I know not everybody is in that space yet, and not all coaches are comfortable with having those conversations and doing that. So I think it's just, it's important to have that. But then again, it's also just important to not let it rule everything, because like I said, there were some days where you can just walk in and it's just a normal day. You're just on your period. I won the Commonwealth Games on my period. It's like I said, you can't change when events are going to come. You can't change when heavy training sessions are going to come. I think actually my last week leading into the Paris Olympics, I was on my period as well, and that was meant to be my last heavy week. And I'm looking at the numbers on my program, and I was like, well, they're going to happen some way or another, because I can't change that day. The event's not going to change. So I just think with all women, you just be sensible, listen to your body. And have those conversations. If you're feeling like you're not in control of it, or you need advice, then talk to people. That's what people are there for. And as athletes, we can't sit here and say that we know it all. That's the reason why we have our team around us, why literally they say it takes a village to raise a child. It takes a village to raise an athlete as well, and get you onto them podiums. There's so many people that have their expertise to tell you what to do, and tap into that, use that, and utilize on that.
Fantastic. So before we get into our next little segment, maybe to wrap this up with our concept of cycle syncing, Professor Phillips, maybe I'll let you do the honors of, from what everyone has said and from what we know from the current evidence and some of the misconceptions that are out there, can you maybe give us what is it we should take away about this concept of having a very prescriptive ability to plan training and nutrition based on cycle?
I would have to think, after listening to all of this, is that, there are some women who definitely need to take a break at certain times in there because there's symptoms, but train according to how you feel. There's nothing that is specific to one phase. That's called autoregulation. It's been around for over 50 years. Men do it too. The whole idea that, if you have a bad night's sleep and you're not ready for a big day of training, then it's not a big day of training. So maybe that's the better way to look at this, rather than one phase is better than the other.
Fantastic. We have a small little segment where I'm going to give each of you about 20 seconds. I believe we might even have a timer to keep you on track with this. And it's any piece of advice that you would want to give people to take away that would help women fuel their performance. And that can be as wide as you wish. It can be any piece of advice that from you would be important to take away. Professor Phillips, on you go.
Don't train like a man or a woman, train like an athlete.
Woo. Yeah. Fantastic. Seconds to spare and everything.
I think, similar to what Stu said, what everyone said, look, from a recovery perspective, we want to tailor the recovery to the exercise that's done. I don't think we need to overcomplicate things by doing things according to the cycle, and just be consistent, train well, eat well, and everything will be fine.
I think I'd say stay consistent, do your foundations and your basics, because the show must go on.
Watch this, fuel for the demands of your sport.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Fantastic.
Well done.